Hey guys, tonight we ease into a strange little corner of history where someone tried to trap clouds in a bottle because he genuinely believed he could weigh the sky. You're standing in a dim room lit by candlelight. There's a tall glass tube, sealed at one end, being slowly tilted into a bowl of liquid metal mercury, and as you watch, the silvery pool drops, leaving a chilling nothingness above it. An emptiness? A vacuum? Except, in 1643, vacuums are more terrifying than ghosts. Most people believe nothing can exist without being filled by something. This isn't just pseudoscience theology. The Church has long condemned the idea of an empty space, calling it a heretical notion, and yet Evangelista Torricelli, a sickly, soft-spoken genius with a high forehead and tired eyes, just created one. In a simple glass tube, he made a space where no air, no water, no ether, no spirit, nothing exists. You probably wouldn't survive this era if you admitted out loud that the sky could be weighed, or that air could press against you. Most folks then assume air has no weight at Elbacars. Well, you don't feel it, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere with skies full of clouds or crystal clear stars, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're drifting off from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You'd never guess this man Torricelli was originally trained to be a priest, but his love of mathematics eclipsed the pulpit. In fact, he once wrote an admiration letter so brilliant to Galileo that the old man invited him to be his assistant, and thus you end up with a young mind standing beside Galileo in his final years, learning how to ask questions no one had dared before. Here's the thing. People have always noticed that when you pump water up from a well, the suction only lifts it so far, about 32 feet. Beyond that, nothing. The water stubbornly refuses to rise. No one knew why. Some said it was the fear of a vacuum, that nature abhorred empty space so much that it would shove water up just to fill the void. But it refused to help beyond a certain point. That seemed oddly emotional for nature. Torricelli, skeptical of emotional liquids, had a wild idea. Maybe it's not that nature hates a vacuum. Maybe it's that air is pushing down with weight, holding everything else in check. In other words, maybe it's the atmosphere doing the heavy lifting. So you prepare an experiment. You fill a long, sealed glass tube with mercury, a dense, silvery liquid, heavy enough to drag the truth into view. Then, with careful hands, you invert the tube into a bowl of more mercury, and something strange happens. Most of the mercury stays put, but a portion falls into the bowl, leaving a gap of space at the top. That space is nothing. No air, no vapor. Just a clean, terrifying void. And suddenly, the mercury in the bowl isn't just sitting there. It's being pushed hard by the weight of the air above it. This is your eureka moment. But of course, 17th century Europe isn't exactly quick to embrace paradigm shifts. Creating a vacuum is still technically blasphemous. Torricelli doesn't publish much about it. He doesn't even live long after Galileo dies. He's only 39 when illness takes him. And yet, his little tube with the shimmering column of mercury would change how we see the sky forever. One fun tidbit. Torricelli's tube wasn't initially seen as a scientific device. Some early observers thought it was a new kind of toy or magic trick. Others panicked that the sealed void might suck out their souls. And yet, even today, we measure air pressure in torrs, a unit named after this soft-voiced mathematician, who spent his final years playing with glassware. Historians still argue whether Torricelli truly understood the full implication of his experiment or if he just stumbled on something bigger than he could imagine. But one thing's clear. He proved airways, something not metaphorically, literally. And from that moment on, people started realizing they'd been swimming through pressure all their lives. You wake up the next morning with a headache, but not from dreaming of mercury tubes and floating vacuums. No, it's something else like pressure building behind your ears, and in 17th century Europe, a suspicious number of windows are cracking. Not from earthquakes, not from storms, just air. This is where the real absurdity begins. You see, to most people back then, air is the absence of anything interesting. It's the background noise of life, the forgotten middle child of the elements. You can't see it, you can't hold it, and it doesn't seem to weigh anything. So when someone like Torricelli claims that the entire sky is pushing down on you every second of the day, with force equal to 1,000 elephants stacked on your head only, diffused of course, you can imagine how well that goes. Over your labelled eccentric, at best possibly cursed, but then the windows start breaking. Here's the thing. If you seal up a room airtight, the pressure inside and the pressure outside are equal balanced. But mess with that balance, maybe remove some air from inside the room, and suddenly the outside atmosphere wins. It pushes inwards, shattering glass and slamming doors shut. This wasn't theory. It happened, and it terrified people. So now, the heavy nothing that Torricelli whispered about becomes something you feel, and for the first time, ordinary folks begin to entertain the idea that maybe air does more than just sit there. Let's take a moment to imagine it. You're walking through a square in Florence. Your boots clop on uneven stones. A man is shouting about apples on sale. And somewhere nearby, a baker's chimney is letting out ribbons of smoke. You glance up, see the blue sky, and think nothing of it. But up there miles of invisible atmosphere are pushing down with incredible force. Every square inch of your skin is feeling over 14 pounds of pressure. That's more than an adult cat per square inch. You're basically covered in air. You don't feel crushed only because your body is pushing back internally. Your fluids, tissues, and bones all carry their own internal pressure, which, when you think about it, is a pretty lucky design feature. This idea that air has mass that it can push, squeeze, and resist starts to reshape science. We move away from the mystical explanations. No more nature hates a vacuum. Instead, nature responds to force. More satisfying, if slightly less poetic. Here's where it gets fun. Some scholars, especially in Paris and Bologna, begin replicating Torricelli's experiment. They try it with water instead of mercury. And you know what happens? They need a tube 13 meters high just to get the same effect. Turns out, mercury is 13.6 times denser than water. So while Torricelli could perform his experiment indoors with a desk-sized setup, his imitators are now lugging church organ pipes into courtyards just to recreate it with water. And then come the devices. Torricelli's simple setup becomes the barometer, an instrument that can measure atmospheric pressure and by extension hint at coming weather. Sudden drop. Rain might be on the way. Pressure rising. Clear skies. The world is beginning to look measurable, predictable, knowable. That idea rattles a few cages. Remember, this is still an era where astrology charts guide medical treatment and comets are interpreted as divine omens. If you tell someone that storms come not from angry gods, but from changes in air pressure, well, you'd better explain it in small words. One fringe group even believed the barometer could detect ghosts, since spirits would surely disturb the weight of the air around them. Barometric haunting? You can't make this up, though. Again, someone definitely did. But the point stands. The more you learn about air, the less boring it becomes. Historians still argue whether the public's growing fascination with that pressure was driven by real understanding or just theatrical gadgetry. Barometers were made into ornate furniture pieces, symbols of wealth and curiosity. People hung them in parlors and stared at the dials like they were magic mirrors. And honestly, in a way, they kind of were. You stand before one now, a brass-rimmed beauty with hand-painted numerals and a trembling needle. The air outside shifts minutely, and the needle quivers. It feels like the sky is talking to you, one whisper at a time. In these moments, the idea of weighing air no longer seems absurd. Instead, it feels essential, like unlocking a language you didn't know you were swimming in your whole life. The heavy nothingness is now something, and as you rest your palm against the cool glass of the barometer, feeling the faint vibration of the world beyond, you can't help but wonder what else is pressing down on you softly, constantly, unseen. Now you're climbing. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, you're physically dragging a long glass tube filled with mercury up a winding, cobblestone path. In one hand, you carry the barometer. In the other, you clutch your aching ribs. And this isn't some leisurely Tuscan stroll either. You're scaling the Tour de Gliacinelli in Bologna, or maybe hiking the slopes of Puy de Dôme in France, all to test a theory that the air pressing on you changes with altitude. Because if Torricelli was right, if the weight of the air is what holds the mercury column in place, then surely climbing higher should lessen the pressure. Less air above you, less weight, and the mercury should fall. So up you go, panting, sweating, wondering how a math problem led to a workout. 17th century science was basically CrossFit with wigs. Enter Blaise Pascal. You may know Pascal from that philosophical wager about believing in God, just in case. But before he was writing apologetics, he was obsessed with air pressure. And because he was too ill to climb a mountain himself, fragile genius that he was, he sent his brother-in-law Florin to do the heavy lifting. Literally, so in Etienne Lobai climbs the Puy de Dôme volcano with a mercury barometer strapped to his back. At the summit, he watches the mercury column fall. Then he descends and watches it rise again. Just like Torricelli predicted, air has weight, and the higher you go, the less of it presses on you. You might be shrugging now. Well, yeah, obviously, but in their time, this was like discovering gravity. It meant the sky wasn't just a painted dome. It had depth, it had pressure, it could be measured, and more importantly, meant that the earth was covered in something real, even if invisible. You stand at the mountaintop, the air thin and cool, your ears popped from the climb, and all around you is the atmosphere, layered like an onion made of oxygen and nitrogen and silent force, a sea of pressure, decreasing with every step upward. And here's a fringe detail to make your toes curl. Some early scientists believed that this gradient of pressure, the way air thinned as you rose, meant that heaven itself might be a vacuum, that God's realm floated beyond the last molecules of air. They weren't exactly right, but you have to admire the poetry. Historians still debate whether Pascal understood just how revolutionary this test would become. To him, it was just confirming Torricelli's idea, but to others, it laid the groundwork for meteorology, aviation, and even modern physics. Now imagine, you're an innkeeper in Clermont-Ferrand, watching this strange man's brother-in-law fumble with glass tubes and bowls of mercury in your courtyard. You offer wine. He declines. He's busy measuring the sky. We take this for granted now, altimeters in planes, pressure readings on our weather apps. But once these numbers came from sore legs and clever guesses. It est a little like discovering a map of a world you've always lived in but never seen. And then there's the logistics. Transporting mercury up a mountain isn't just risky, it's downright dangerous. It sloshes, it spills, it's toxic. So climb isn't just brave, it's borderline mad, also fun. Some versions of the story say locals thought he was an alchemist. There were whispers that he might be summoning demons. After all, what kind of person hauls shiny liquid metal to a volcano and stares into a tube all afternoon? Apparently, this whole idea that you can observe the atmosphere like it's a mechanical system begins to take root. Science stops being confined to university halls and cloisters. Now, you can take your curiosity on the road up towers, into forests, onto ships, everywhere you go. The pressure tells a story. And maybe the most amazing thing is how quiet it all is. The mercury doesn't shout. The air doesn't scream as it shifts. Everything changes in silence. But when you hold the tube, you see the world breathe. That's the beauty of it. Not explosions, not fire or fanfare, just a slow, silver column rising or falling in response to the sky's weight. So you descend the mountain, you return to your dusty home, and in your pack, you carry a single glass instrument that proved once and for all that the atmosphere isn't just air, it's architecture. Now you're back at your workshop, sleeves rolled up, eyes squinting through the light of a flickering oil lamp, and in front of you, a bowl of mercury, a very tall glass tube, and the nagging suspicion that your neighbors think you're building a weapon. You're not. You're building a revolution in a tube. This is where mercury really starts to shine literally and figuratively. It isn't just a heavy, silvery liquid that behaves like molten mirror. It becomes your language for understanding air. Because mercury doesn't compress easily, doesn't evaporate much, and its weight is consistent. Perfect for measuring the invisible. So you fill your glass tube open at one end, sealed at the other with mercury. Carefully invert it into the bowl. And there it is again. The drop, the space, the eerie little pocket of nothing above the mercury column. At sea level, the height stabilizes around 760 millimeters, a number that becomes iconic. Standard air pressure, 1 atmosphere, 1 torr per millimeter. Torricelli's quiet claim to fame. But why mercury? Why not water, wine, or even oil? Well, imagine a 33-foot-tall barometer in your living room. Because that's how tall it would have to be with water. Mercury is dense, 13.6 times denser than water, so it shrinks the required tube down to something manageable. Also, it looks awesome, like a quicksilver ribbon climbing a glass mountain. But here's a detail most people miss. Mercury is toxic, dangerously so. And while we know that now, Torricelli and his contemporaries were merrily sloshing it around with bare hands, letting it splash and glimmer like a party trick, some historians wonder if repeated exposure may have shortened Torricelli's life. He only lived to 39. Coincidence? Maybe. But those silvery tools weren't without their cost. And yet, despite the risks, mercury became a staple of experimentation. It was used in thermometers, barometers, air pumps even, early mirrors. Here's a fringe detail for you. In the 1600s, some thought mercury wasn't really a liquid. They believed it was tiny, solid particles moving so quickly they only looked fluid, which isn't entirely wrong if you're thinking in terms of atoms, but it sure confused a lot of alchemists. The barometer's rise becomes a bit of a fad. Soon, other scientists, Boyle in England, Gericke in Germany, begin building on Torricelli's ideas. Pumps, vacuums, sealed chambers. They start crafting tools that allow you to play with pressure like it's a musical instrument. Some even try to make floating objects rise and fall using pressure changes, which leads eventually to the idea of the airship. But we'll get to that. Right now, you're watching Mercury tell you a story a slow, shimmering movement that responds to the whims of the sky. You tap the glass, it dances slightly. The air outside shifts just a little, and the column obeys, rising and falling with a pressure like the tide of an invisible ocean. Historians still argue whether Torricelli thought of his invention as a tool or a proof of concept. He didn't write much. His work was published posthumously, and he never got to see how the world ran with his idea. The scientific community was still warming up to this whole invisible forces are measurable thing. But soon, even farmers start taking notice. A sudden drop in pressure means bad weather's coming. Arise, good day, to hang laundry. Torricelli's barometer became not just a scientific tool, but a practical one. And practical science, that's the stuff that lasts. Now imagine this. You're an Italian noble visiting your friend's villa. In his study is a strange, tall glass cylinder next to a bowl of shiny silver goop. You ask what it is. He smiles and says, "It tells me when the air is heavier." You sip your wine, nod, and pretend to understand, even though you're 95% sure he's dabbling in witchcraft. Fun aside, in England, one barometer owner kept it next to a mounted toad in a jar. He believed the toad's movement combined with the mercury's rise or fall could double his forecasting accuracy. Two wrongs trying to make a right. But the point is, people began to trust the barometer. In a world full of omens and astrology and vaguely angry gods, here was a tool that spoke with subtlety and consistency. You could wake up, check the tube, and plan your day, all thanks to a man who once stood in a quiet room and dared to ask, "What if the air has weight?" You stare into the top of the glass tube, that empty space above the mercury, and something gnaws at your mind. Not curiosity terror, because you're looking at nothing. And in the 1600s, nothing is a very big problem. This brings us to the vacuum scandal. You might think scientists back then would be thrilled to discover a vacuum that clean, silent absence above the mercury column. But no, to them, a vacuum isn't just unsettling. It's blasphemous. The church has long declared that nature abhors a vacuum. This wasn't metaphorical. It was a real, enforceable belief. Aristotle himself had declared it impossible for nothing to exist. After all, if God is everywhere, then empty space is godless. Let that simmer in your sleep-deprived brain. So, when Torricelli creates a vacuum in a glass tube, he doesn't just challenge physics. He challenges theology. And here's where it gets spicy. The church didn't appreciate being challenged by glass. Creating emptiness meant denying that God filled all space, which could get you a one-way ticket to an inquisitor's candlelit queue, and A. Torricelli was wise enough to stay quiet. He avoided publishing too much, stayed in his little corner of Florence, and let the mercury speak for itself. But others weren't so cautious. Meet Otto von Guericke, a German mayor with serious steampunk vibes. Guericke built a massive vacuum pump out of copper and leather. He pumped air out of a sealed metal sphere until it created such suction that on each side couldn't pull the halves apart. This became famous as the Magdeburg Hemisphere's demonstration. And you better believe people showed up for the drama. A vacuum, it turns out, had become theatre. People gasped. They cheered. They whispered about demons. One man fainted. Historians still argue whether Guericke's public stunts helped shift public opinion or just made science seem like sorcery with better props. But what's undeniable is this. The vacuum, once feared, was now fascinating. You can feel it in the crowd, the AOD, the discomfort, the curiosity. Everyone trying to reconcile centuries of belief with a silent, hollow space inside a shiny sphere or a glass tube. And here's a delicious irony. The idea that nature abhors a vacuum. was still being printed in books next. 2 diagrams showing barometers working precisely because of vacuums. Cognitive dissonance in Latin is still cognitive dissonance. This transition from fear to fascination mirrored Europe's broader awakening. Science was shifting from speculation to experimentation. People were no longer content to explain nature with metaphors alone. They wanted numbers, measurements, repeatable proof, and nothing demonstrated that better than a tube that visibly refused to fill at the top. You stare at the vacuum again, this time with a different feeling. It doesn't look evil, it doesn't even look dangerous. It just is. A quiet fact of nature. That's the wild thing. The vacuum isn't loud or flashy. It's a whisper in absence that reveals present. By measuring the void, you learn about the weight of everything else. A fringe idea started to pop up in these years. What if space, the stars, the heavens weren't filled with celestial spheres or divine ether, but vacuum? What if the universe itself was mostly nothing? That was enough to keep some scholars awake at night. And if you're listening to this trying to fall asleep, well, one man even proposed that light might travel better through a vacuum, unimpeded by any medium. An early glimmer of the science we'd use to bounce lasers off the moon centuries later. But in your quiet workshop, you're just trying to keep the mercury from spilling. You're aware now that every time you create that vacuum, you're poking a hole in centuries of dogma, and somehow no lightning bolt has struck you down. The heavens remain intact. Turns out they can handle a little empty space. You're packing for a trip, but not the kind with maps and luggage. This one involves fragile glass, shimmering mercury, and a lot of uphill walking. Why? Because you're about to become a very committed Meet Florin, an otherwise ordinary man who ends up playing an extraordinary role in the history of science. He's Blaise Pascal's guinea pig, and his task is simple on paper. Carry a barometer up a mountain, take a reading, and prove that air has weight. But let's rewind just a little. By this time, Pascal, a mathematician, philosopher, and frequent insomniac, is obsessed with Teresa work. He's intrigued by the idea that the pressure of the air changes depending on your altitude. But like many men of big ideas and fragile health, Pascal isn't about to hike up a volcano himself. So he does what any visionary with a bad immune system would do. He convinces his sister's husband to do it for him. You wake up on a chilly morning in 1648. Someone hands you a letter, some instructions, and a barometer. You blink, you sigh, you begin walking. Your destination, Puy-de-Dôme, a dormant volcano in central France. The path winds through pine forests, cold morning fog hanging low across the trail. You stop every few hundred feet to take a pressure reading carefully, noting how far the mercury column has dropped. Every step upward, a little less pressure. Every foot climbed, a little less sky pushing down on you. By the time you reach the summit, you're breathless, not just from the altitude, but from the realization that it worked. The barometer reading is several millimeters lower than it was at the base. The air really does weigh something. Historians still debate whether this was the moment public belief began to shift, or if it was just another strange footnote in an era still half asleep in superstition. But to Pascal, and this was everything, they had proof, not just theory, evidence. And once the results are published, the scientific world begins to stir. Letters fly across Europe, philosophers argue, professors squint suspiciously at glass tubes. Even Isaac Newton later references Pascal's observations when exploring the idea of ether and gravity. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's a certain romance to his journey that gets lost in the textbooks. He wasn't a scientist. He didn't design the barometer. He didn't even come up with the idea. He just climbed. And sometimes that what moves science forward, someone willing to carry the weight of curiosity up a hill. Also worth noting, they didn't climb alone. They brought along skeptical observers, local priests, noble students, so that no one could claim the readings were faked. There were witnesses at every point, nodding gravely as the mercury dipped lower with each ascent. It turned into a kind of open-air theatre. Imagine an impromptu scientific summit on a mountaintop. Everyone gathered around a glass tube and a trembling column of silver. You can almost hear the wind blowing across their wide-brimmed hats. And down in the village, people were probably muttering about sorcery again. Fun aside, some local myths claimed the volcano was hollowed out by breath of dragons, which, if you think about it, is kind of a poetic way to describe decreasing air pressure. The experiment even caught the attention of Descartes, who didn't quite believe the results, but admitted they were interesting. And that's the best part. Every time the mercury dropped, it pulled doubt down with it. Torricelli had started a quiet revolution. Pascal had refined it, and, of all people, had carried it up a mountain and shouted it from the summit. Well, in measured tones and very neat handwriting. Today, we take altitude-based pressure changes for granted. Airplanes, hiking, watches, even your weather app, they all owe a little something to that quiet hike in 1648. And yet, if you close your eyes, you can still picture it. The trail, the frost, the glint of mercury against a sky that no longer seems quite so unknowable. Now imagine you're sitting at a dinner table in 1650, chewing on roasted partridge, and someone across from you says, "You know, siphons only work because nature abhors a vacuum." You pause. You are this close to enjoying your meal. This bizarre dinner conversation, believe it or not, was common among thinkers of the time, because even as the barometer gained traction, the old ideas just wouldn't die quietly. Let's talk about the so-called devil's drink straw. That's what some folks called the simple IU-shaped tube that moves liquid from one container to another. To them, it wasn't physics. It was black magic, or at the very least, suspicious behavior by nature. According to the reigning wisdom for centuries, Aristotle again, the guy's fingerprints are everywhere. Natia hates a vacuum. So, if you create one, Natia rushes in to fill it. Like a dog frantically covering up a hole in the garden it didn't even dig. This idea explained everything from why pumps worked to why water flowed through pipes. But as more people experimented with actual vacuums, they realized that nature wasn't emotionally invested. It wasn't abhorred or disturbed. It just obeyed pressure gradients. Still, the phrase stuck, because it sounded true. You sip wine from a goblet and glance across the table again. Your dinner guest continues. You see, the wine rizzes because it hates being separated from the rest of itself. By this point, you've seen Pascal's notes. You know better. But centuries of poetic nonsense die hard. Let's break down the siphon for a second. You fill the U-tube with liquid. Seal both ends with your thumbs. Then place one end in a full container and the other in an empty one, placed lower down. Remove your thumbs, and the liquid flows uphill briefly and then down into the lower container. It looks like magic, but it's just pressure. Atmospheric pressure pushes down harder on the higher container than on the lower one, and gravity does the rest. But back then, without our modern understanding of molecules or forces, this was mystical, even terrifying. One fringe philosopher suggested that water was alive and moved like a creature trying to escape discomfort. Another insisted that liquids had memory, which, ironically, has popped up again in modern homeopathy circles. So apparently bad ideas also have memory. Historians still argue whether the shift away from nature's hatred into physical reasoning happened because of barometers and vacuums, or Whether it was just good timing, the invention of better pumps definitely helped, as did dramatic demonstrations. Picture yourself in a public square in Paris. A man in a powdered wig places a long glass siphon between two barrels. He churns slattern under his breath for effect, obviously, and then opens the flow. The water moves, and the crowd gasps. It's not that they've never seen it before, it's that they're starting to believe there's no spirit inside it, no divine push, just pressure. You lean back and think, maybe the world is simpler than they told you, and also weirder, like this. Someone once tried to design a perpetual motion machine using siphons. The idea was to keep the water flowing in a loop forever. Spoiler, it didn't work, but it did make its way into dozens of 17th century sketchbooks, always with titles like Infinite Fountain of Nature or God's Eternal Wine Trick. Here's a curious tidbit. Some early pipe systems in monasteries relied on siphons to distribute holy water between chapels, which meant monks were unknowingly defying the laws of nature, just to keep their fonts full. You get the sense that science, back then, wasn't always about grand revolutions. Sometimes it was about noticing that your drink straw worked even if your explanation didn't. And slowly, very slowly, belief shifted. The vacuum wasn't something to fear. It was something to use. Siphons, pumps, tubes, they weren't tools of the devil, they were tools of understanding. So next time you see a kid slurping soda through a curly straw, remember, that little physics trick once terrified philosophers, and it all circles back to pressure, air, weight, balance, not emotion, not divine intervention, just the quiet, steady rhythm of the world pushing against itself. Tonight, you sit cross-legged on the floor of your candlelit study, a quill in one hand and your head in the other. You are officially trying to calculate the weight of the sky. This isn't a metaphor. You're not writing poetry. You are actually trying to measure how much all the air above the earth weighs. The entire atmosphere. And it's not going well. The numbers are slippery. The units don't match. You've spilled ink on your trousers. Also, you've just accidentally set a corner of your notes on fire with the candle. Well done. But here's the thing. This absurd-sounding task is exactly what scientists like Blaise Pascal, Robert Boyle, and even early Newtonians were attempting in the 17th century, because now that we've established that air has pressure, real, measurable weight. Next question is, how much? And so begins the great atmospheric math headache of the Enlightenment. Let's start simple. The pressure you feel at sea level is about 1 atmosphere defined, retroactively, as the pressure required to hold up a column of mercury 760 millimeters high. That's around 14.7 pounds per square inch. Seems reasonable, but multiply that by every square inch of the Earth's surface, every square inch, from tundra to tulip field, and suddenly you're talking about a very heavy sky. Roughly 5.5 quadrillion tons. Yes, tons. That's the estimated mass of all the air above us. You're basically being gently crushed by an invisible mountain. Luckily, you're made to push back. But here's a tricky part. Back then, no one had a firm handle on things like air density at different altitudes, or how gravity behaves as you move away from the Earth's surface. So the calculations were part physics, part guesswork, and part desperate prayer. Still, they tried. Some even attempted to create scale models of the Earth, calculating downward force based on decreasing pressure layers like an atmospheric onion, peeled one paper-thin slice at a time. Fringe detail. One French engineer built a hollow copper globe to simulate pressure at altitude, using trapped gas and sealed chambers. It exploded. Safety protocols were not a thing. Historians still argue whether the earliest attempts to measure atmospheric mass were scientifically valid, or mostly inspired daydreaming with math. But even rough estimates started changing how people thought about air itself. It wasn't empty. It wasn't passive. It was massive. Even your breath, those light puffs drifting through your nostrils, contains measurable weight. An average human breath displaces about 0.5 liters of air, weighing just over half a gram. You inhale. You are holding weight inside your body. A soft, invisible cargo. It's enough to make you sit back and whisper, "Whoa!" And then there's this. The realization that air, in all its lightness, can move weight around. Think of wind. A breeze can push leaves. A gust can knock you over. A storm can rip a ship from its anchor and toss it like a toy. You're dealing with a substance that, though invisible, can carve stone over time. All because it has mass. This leads to a cascade of strange experiments. Men weigh balloons. They trap gases. They design brass chambers and tiny pendulums to measure minute differences in weight when air is added or removed. Some even claim they can feel air being heavier on certain days. You're not sure whether that's science or seasonal allergies. But the point is, the atmosphere has officially entered the measurable realm. One eccentric gentleman in Prague insists that the air above his house weighs more than the air over his neighbor's house, because his home is more philosophically upright. You smile politely and edge toward the door. Meanwhile, actual scientists are making progress. Slowly, bit by bit, the atmosphere is being mapped, its layers identified, its pressure points charted, its density graphed, and it all started with that first tube of mercury, with Torricelli staring into a vacuum and thinking, maybe this nothing is something after all. Now you, centuries later, sit in a soft chair under an electric lamp and check the weather app on your phone. You see a pressure reading, 10-13 millibars. You don't even think about it. But that number, that quiet little value, is a measure of the sky pressing down on you. It's the sum total of all the weight from clouds, air, molecules, and dust floating between you and space, and cities, wraps the earth in a pressurized hug, and only rarely reminds you how powerful it really is. You're not under the atmosphere, you're within it. Every breath you take is like dipping a spoon into a vast, heavy ocean, one that floats above mountains. You're in a room full of glass, brass, and faintly toxic optimism. It's the late 1600s, and scientific curiosity is buzzing through Europe like static. Everyone with a powdered wig and a Latin dictionary is either building an experiment or pretending they understand someone else's. And at the center of this quietly chaotic renaissance is Robert Boyle. That Boyle, the one from Boyle's Law. You're about to watch him try to trap air, squeeze it, and see what happens. No pressure. Boyle, an English nobleman with a habit of writing extremely polite letters and mildly unhinged lab notes, takes Torricelli's barometer and asks a deeper question. If air has weight, and weight means force, what happens if you change the space it lives in? So he teams up with Robert Hooke, yes, that Hooke, the guy with the microscope and the messy genius energy, and the two of them build something wild. A pneumatic engine, basically an air pump. But don't picture anything sleek or industrial. This thing looks like a cross between a butter churn, a bell jar, and an overly ambitious accordion. You place a small object, a candle, a feather, a cricket inside a glass chamber, seal it, and begin pumping out the air, one squeaky lever pull at a time, and then you watch. The candle flickers and dies. The feather doesn't fall lit, just hangs there, suspended in eerie stillness. And the cricket, well, the cricket eventually stops chirping. Cue the dramatic gasp from 17th century observers. Boyle's experiments reveal that without air, nothing works the way it should. Sound disappears. Flames vanish. Life falters. You're not just removing pressure, you're removing a medium. This leads Boyle to formulate his famous law. At constant temperature, the pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to its volume. Or, in sleepier terms, squish air into a smaller space, and the pressure goes up. Let it expand, and the pressure drops. Seems simple, but at the time, Boyle begins testing it every way he can think of. He builds different pump chambers. He measures how much a balloon expands when air is removed. He even sticks living creatures inside his glass dome. Spoiler, this gets ethically iffy. Mice, birds, frogs all become part of Boyle's let. See what happens in a vacuum series? He called it animal respiration experiments. Modern ethicists would call it a yikes moment. Historians still argue whether Boyle's cold detachment came from scientific rigor or upper-class but either way, the results were clear. Living things need air, not just as a medium, as a requirement, and suddenly, air wasn't just pressure or mass, it was life. That was the big shift. You could measure it, you could weigh it, and now you knew that to be without it was to be without breath. It wasn't just the sky pressing down, it was the invisible sea in which everything floated, a delicate balance of force, volume, and vitality. Boyle published his findings in 1660 in New Experiments, Physico-Mechanical, with a title long enough to be a chapter on its own, and the scientific community, they were floored. Even Isaac Newton referenced Boyle's law as foundational, because without it, you can't understand gases. Without gases, you can't understand the atmosphere, and without atmosphere, well, you've got a lifeless rock. Also, fun fringe fact. Boyle believed in invisible particles long before atoms were accepted. He thought air might be full of tiny, spring-like particles that could be compressed and stretched. Kind of adorable when you imagine the entire atmosphere as a giant mattress being fluffed by physics. And remember, Boyle's experiments weren't hidden in royal laboratories. They were shared, copied, repeated. Soon, barometers and air pumps became part of the gentleman scientist's toolkit, like a fancy walking cane, but nerdier and more likely to endanger your pet mouse. You picture it now. A drawing room in London. A group of powdered intellectuals gathered around a pump, politely arguing in Latin about vacuum resistance, while someone in the back sips brandy and quietly tries to revive the bird in the jar. All of it began with Teresi's column of mercury. And now, we're starting to realize the atmosphere isn't just something you live under. It's something you live inside. A compressible, measurable, breathable envelope that wraps the world in a tender yet unrelenting hug. And sometimes, just for fun, we try to pump it out just to see what disappears first. Now you're in a balloon. Not a party balloon. A giant, creaking, silk-wrapped globe tethered by ropes and ambition, carrying you and a handful of brave men into the upper reaches of the sky. Because here's the next big leap in the story of weighing air. If pressure decreases with height and we measured that on hills and towers. What happens if you just keep going up? Welcome to the 18th century and the birth of aerostats. Hotter and gas balloons become the new frontier of scientific curiosity. And what better way to test the atmosphere than to float through it? The first manned balloon flight takes place in 1783, courtesy of the Montgolfier brothers. Their balloon, inflated with hot smoke, lifts 2 passengers, 1 nobleman, and 1 scientist off the ground and into stunned silence. You're up there with them now. The crowd below shrinks. The buildings look like toys, and the air It gets thinner, colder, your breath comes a little harder. You're not just flying. You're riding through layers of atmosphere that Torricelli and Pascal could only imagine. And of course, someone has brought a barometer along, because we're not here just for the view, we're here to measure. And the mercury drops. As altitude increases, the column shrinks. Exactly as predicted. It's quiet proof that the barometer works even when tied to a wicker basket drifting over France. But the deeper truth is dawning. Air is not evenly distributed. It's layered, structured, and dynamic. Historians still debate whether early balloonists grasped the meteorological implications of what they were doing. Some thought they were touching heaven. Others were mostly hoping not to crash into a windmill. Meanwhile, scientific balloonists, like Alexander von Humboldt, start using balloons to study pressure, temperature, and gas composition at different heights. They even bring barometers, thermometers, birds, and occasionally bottles of brandy. That last one isn't for science, it's for the landing. Because going up is easy, coming down gently, that's the tricky bit. There's one particularly unsettling fringe experiment. In the early 1800s, a French scientist releases a pigeon at 10,000 feet. It flaps, flails, then drops like a stone, unable to breathe. That's when it hits you. This thing we call air isn't just presence, it's proximity. Too high, and there's not enough of it to support life. The atmosphere doesn't just fade, it thins. Like frosting scraped from the top of a cake, every layer less generous than the last. Balloon flights become laboratory. They observe that temperature drops as you ascend, cold air clinging to the top of the world. They note how clouds gather at certain heights, never above. They realize that the sky, far from being uniform, is a strange gradient of pressure and breathability. And this realization slowly gives birth to meteorology. Suddenly, we're not just measuring pressure, we're correlating it with weather. You notice that low pressure tends to bring storms. High pressure brings calm, and people who once stared suspiciously at barometers now mount them proudly above fireplaces, using them to predict when to harvest crops or cancel fishing trips. It's not perfect, but it's better than guessing based on the ache in your uncle's knee. Meanwhile, the altimeter is born, a device that uses barometric pressure to estimate height, which means, for the first time, humans can estimate how high they are above sea level using only air. That's wild when you think about it. You're in a basket, drifting through clouds, and a column of mercury is whispering to you, you're 3,000 feet up. Keep breathing slowly. And you do, because even though you're surrounded by sky, you're also surrounded by less of it. You realize now that you don't live beneath the ear, you live at the bottom of an ocean of gas. And like all oceans, it gets cold, lonely, and quiet near the top. You've returned to solid ground. Your boots sink gently into damp soil as you stand in an open field, barometer in hand, staring at the sky like it owes you money. Because now, it's not just about how heavy the air is, it's about what the air does with that weight. Welcome to the dawn of weather prediction. It starts with something wonderfully humble. The weather diary. You rise each morning, step outside, and jot down what you see: clouds, wind direction, temperature, pressure. Then you do the same thing the next day, and the next, and slowly patterns emerge. Low barometric pressure, storms tend to follow. High pressure, the air feels clearer, drier, calm. And over months, you begin to feel like the air is trying to talk to you through the mercury. This is where science and superstition mingle like cousins at a wedding. You still hear people muttering that bad air brings bad moods, or fog means ghosts. But now you also hear things like pressure, S dropping, fast get rain before nightfall. You're in the grey zone between folklore and forecast. Historians still argue whether this transition this long, slow merging of barometers and calendars was truly scientific, or more of a ritual wrapped in data. But the effect was real. People stopped simply enduring the weather, they began anticipating it. Enter Fitzroy. Robert Fitzroy, captain of the HMS Beagle, eventually becomes the head of Britain's first official weather service in the 1850s. He uses barometric readings from across the country to issue early storm warnings. He coins the term weather forecast, and people think he's mad until he's right. One fringe tidbit. Fitzroy reportedly carried a barometer on his person, almost constantly. He checked it like you check your phone. No pressure. But he treated it as if it could whisper the future into his ear. You picture him standing on a cliff, coat flapping in the wind, tapping the glass of his portable barometer and mumbling, "It's going to blow." Meanwhile, in houses across Europe, the barometer becomes part of the furniture. It hangs beside the coat rack. It sits above the fireplace. It's often carved from dark wood and labeled with dramatic words like rain, stormy, or fair as, if it's judging your picnic plans. The design evolves too. We get aneroid barometers, mechanical, mercury-free versions that use a tiny metal box that flexes with air pressure. Safer, simpler, and much less likely to poison your cat. And that's when barometers go everywhere. On ships, in trains, in schools, even in handbags. Some early pocket barometers were sold with tiny magnifying glasses and brass hinges. Scientific bling for the well-heeled and slightly paranoid. But it's not just about fashion. People now live with barometric data. Fishermen check it before casting their nets. Farmers rely on it to time their harvests. Doctors even begin to associate pressure changes with joint pain and migraines, though scientists still debate that link. You step back and realize the weight of air isn't just a scientific curiosity anymore. It's practical knowledge. It's survival. And that's the quiet genius of Torricelli's invention. He didn't just prove that air has weight, he gave the world a way to see it. One slender column of mercury became the world's most elegant, silent messenger. It told you when to open the windows, when to secure the sails, when to bring the sheep in early, and in doing so, it reshaped how humans interacted with the sky. Suddenly, the heavens weren't untouchable, they were measurable, predictable, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit understandable. Now you're standing on a battlefield, not one with muskets and sabers but charts, thermometers, and fiercely scribbled telegrams, because by the 19th century, the barometer is no longer just a household curiosity. It has become a weapon of time, the tool that lets you prepare for what's coming before it strikes. And nowhere is that more urgent than in naval warfare. You're in the belly of a ship, rocking gently in the harbor. The captain has a barometer bolted to the bulkhead. He glances at it, not with awe, but with expectation. Because out here, wind isn't poetic, it's logistical. A pressure drop might mean the fleet should hold position, or flee. Back on land, where their offices are sprouting like mushrooms, observers telegraph pressure readings to central stations. Clerks chart the data into lines and swirls on massive paper maps, and then something magical happens. A man in London draws a curved line over a map of Europe, connecting equal points of pressure. The isobar is born. For the first time, we don't just know that air has weight, we can draw it. That's huge. Now you can see pressure patterns forming like bruises on the skin of the sky. You watch as low-pressure systems swirl across the continent, dragging storms behind them. High-pressure ridges settle in, holding off rain like invisible walls. And then it clicks. Air pressure isn't random. It has structure. Meteorology becomes a formal science. No longer a guessing game. It's now a data-driven network of measurements. Temperature, humidity, wind speed, and always barometric pressure. Historians still argue whether the barometer deserves top billing in the invention of the weather map, or if it merely played backup to thermometers and telegraphs. But without pressure readings, the map is just colors. With them, it breathes. Here's a curious aside. In 1863, the British Board of Trade issued barometers to every ship captain who would take one, calling them storm glasses. Some superstitious sailors refused, believing the instrument itself caused bad weather. One captain reportedly smashed his barometer during a squall, shouting, "No more of your do." Meanwhile, inland, barometers quietly influenced agriculture. In the American Midwest, farmers began noting that specific pressure drops preceded hailstorms. In India, monsoon timing was linked to long-term pressure cycles. And then came aviation. Suddenly, knowing the pressure wasn't just helpful, it was essential. You needed to know where the air was thinner, where storms were brewing, how fast you were rising. So pilots began relying on barometric Picture a cockpit in 1910. Leather helmet, goggles, the roar of a sputtering engine, and a tiny round dial marked in altitude measured in millimeters of mercury or inches. Without it, you don't know how high you are. You just know you're above a world that's slowly shrinking beneath you. And yet, you owe that safety to a glass tube invented in a quiet Italian workshop nearly 3 centuries earlier. Torricelli never flew. He never held he never looked at a weather map. But his idea that air has weight became the scaffolding for everything from storm prediction to flight navigation. You feel it now. The weight of air isn't just pressing down on your shoulders, it's woven into the blueprints of your world. The news you watch, the plane you board, the weather app you check before leaving home, all of it. Speaking the language of pressure, you glance at the nearest window. The sky is calm, but the air is always moving, pushing, swirling, adjusting, and somewhere, a barometer is tracking it all. Let's leave the skies for a moment. Now you're indoors surrounded by polished wood, brass knobs, ticking instruments. You're in a Victorian drawing room, and on the wall hangs a magnificent, ornately carved barometer. It's both an instrument and a statement piece, because in the 19th century, air pressure becomes fashionable. Barometers, once the domain of monks and now decorate the homes of the curious, the elite, and the comfortably skeptical. You brush your fingers over the labeled dial. Stormy, rain, change, fair, very dry. You don't know what it all means exactly, but it makes you feel informed, prepared, slightly superior. This is the era of gentleman science. After all, you collect fossils. You read Darwin with your afternoon tea, and you check the barometer before deciding whether to go for a walk. But there's something deeper happening here. As the 1800s progress, pressure measurements quietly become part of everyday life. Mariners use them. Merchants consult them before sending goods down. Even farmers in Yorkshire start treating barometric shifts as more reliable than the almanac. And when you go into a shop to buy one, you're offered a style. Do you prefer a banjo shape? A wheel face? Something with a nautical flair? Perhaps a bit of ivory inlay? Suddenly, understanding the atmosphere is not just useful, it's tasteful. But while you're polishing the brass, something else is happening outside the walls of your parlor. Science is moving forward. Physicists are asking new questions. Not just how much does air weigh, but what is air made of? And that's when barometry collides with chemistry. By the late 1800s, scientists are isolating gases: oxygen, nitrogen, argon, and realizing that air isn't one uniform substance. It's a mixture. The mercury column you've been watching rise and fall, It's responding not to one thing, but to a symphony of invisible players. Each gas has a role. Each exerts partial pressure. Welcome to Dalton's law, concept stating that the total pressure of a gas mixture equals the sum of the pressures of its components. It's like learning your favorite song is actually a layered remix. You see the world differently now. The barometer isn't just reacting to air, it's reacting to molecules, particles bouncing around inside a massive, gaseous ocean. Historians still argue whether Dalton's ideas were understood broadly in his lifetime, or whether most people simply nodded and went back to polishing their weather knobs. Either way, the world was changing. Engineers began using pressure calculations to design steam engines more efficiently. Miners carried portable barometers to assess whether ventilation was failing if pressure dropped too fast. They knew danger was coming. Even mountaineers started making pressure-based oxygen estimates as they ascended new peaks. And then there's this fringe fact. Victorian doctors believed sudden barometric changes could cause melancholy. Yes, if the mercury fell, your mood might. 2. Barometer equals emotional forecast. Sounds silly until you realize some modern hospitals still track pressure trends when managing certain chronic pain cases. So, maybe they were onto something, or maybe everyone just needed a nap, but the truth remains. From the lab to the living room, from weather offices to hiking expeditions, the barometer had become one of the most quietly influential tools of the age. All of it anchored in that first, strange moment when Torricelli tipped mercury into a glass tube and created a vacuum. And centuries later, here you are, in your softly lit room, barometer ticking behind you, rain tapping gently at the window. The air feels heavier today. Not oppressively, just enough to remind you. It's still pressing, still whispering its weight. And somewhere, the mercury is moving ever so slightly, keeping perfect track. You're standing in a lab now. It smells faintly of ozone, solder, and the kind of overconfidence that comes with wearing a white coat. We're in the 20th century, and the barometer is about to shed its wood-paneled waistcoat and put on some wires and circuits. Because pressure, once the stuff of mercury tubes and gentlemen's scholars, is about to go digital. Enter the electronic barometer. Instead of measuring how high mercury rises in a tube, now we're measuring how a little sliver of metal bends when the air presses on it. That's called a strain gauge, and it's sensitive enough to register the faintest changes in atmospheric pressure. One gentle exhale near it, and you're reading data on a screen. You're not just watching the air, you're digitizing it. And with this shift, the barometer moves from fireplace, mantles, and naval decks into airplanes, rockets, satellites, and eventually your pocket. Yes, you sitting here, trying to fall asleep while listening to bedtime history, probably own a smartphone that includes a tiny, invisible barometric sensor. It helps track elevation. It fine-tunes GPS. It even knows when you've walked up the stairs. You carry a pressure sensor in your pocket, more powerful than anything Pascal or Boyle ever dreamed of. Let that settle in. Modern barometry now uses things like piezo crystals, materials that generate tiny electric signals when stressed by air pressure. It's how aircraft measure altitude with hair-splitting precision, how satellites track storms from orbit, how submarines estimate depth using the pressure of water above. Historians still debate whether Torricelli would recognize these modern instruments as descendants of his mercury column, or if he'd quietly faint at the idea of glassless pressure readings. Either way, his legacy is encoded in every weather balloon, in every altimeter, in every climate model, and now there's something new. We don't just measure pressure, we map it in 4 dimensions: width, height, depth, and time. With global networks of sensors on land, sea, and satellite we watch pressure patterns swirl across the Earth in real time. When a hurricane begins to spin over the Atlantic, we see it forming in low-pressure zones. When a heat dome stalls over a continent, we track its edges by observing where the pressure holds firm. And it's not just science, it's protection. Modern barometric data helps governments evacuate cities before typhoons hit. It allows commercial jets to cruise at altitudes where the air is stable. It supports climate models, predicting long-term changes in weather systems. Fringe tidbit. Scientists have even begun looking at pressure patterns on Mars. NASA's landers include barometers to help understand Martian weather, from dust storms to temperature shifts. Turns out, even a planet with a wafer-thin atmosphere still obeys the rules of pressure. You're no longer weighing just Earth's air. You're weighing the cosmos. Think about that. A quiet observation made in 1643. Air must have weight. Has now helped us decode the skies of other worlds. And what's more astonishing is that the principle remains the same. From mercury in a glass tube to silicon chips on a rover's wing, it's all still about the dance between space and pressure. And here you are back in your room, soft blanket tucked under your chin, listening to this gentle spiral of history. Maybe the air feels heavier now. Or maybe you're just noticing it more, the stillness around you. That's not silence. It's a balance of weight, of pressure, of delicate force. Every breath you take presses back against an entire atmosphere, and somewhere in your phone, a tiny circuit records the moment. You sit quietly now, surrounded by the hush of everything you've learned. The air feels different. Not heavier, exactly, but fuller, more alive with meaning, because you've walked slowly, gently through centuries of invisible weight, from the slosh of mercury in a Florentine workshop to silent glass domes, where candles sputtered and birds dozed, to wicker baskets scraping clouds, to satellites whispering pressure reports from the edge of space. And all of it began with a question so absurd it felt almost childish. Does air weigh anything? Torricelli answered it by making the weight visible. He didn't yell. He didn't conquer. He watched a column fall and said, "The vacuum is real." From there, the world bloomed with implications. We learned that storms form not by wrath, but by pressure drops. That mountain peaks steal your breath, not with awe, but with thinner air. That balloons don't rise by magic but by physics. That even silence has a substance. And perhaps the most poetic truth of all, you've never been weightless. Even when you leap, even when you float in a pool, even when you feel unburdened by thought or emotion, the air wraps around you, pushing, pressing, whispering, its ancient weight against your skin. Historians still argue whether Torricelli fully understood the revolution he sparked. But tonight, you do. You've followed that idea across centuries, watched it get muddied, refined, measured, digitized, and launched into orbit. And somehow, it still returns to a single image. A man pouring mercury into a glass tube, waiting, watching, listening to nothing, seeing everything. And now you lie in bed, eyes closed, knowing the weight of the sky hasn't changed. You've just learned how to feel it. Let your breath soften now. Let your chest rise and fall without thought, without effort, just easy, quiet movement through the ocean of air that cradles the planet. You don't have to hold anything anymore. Not curiosity, not questions, not even the weight of the sky. It's all still there. Of course, the air is pressing against the roof, your windows, your blankets, but now you know it's not heavy out of malice. It's heavy because it's real. And reality, once understood, becomes less threatening, more familiar. Let the old images settle like dust in your mind. Pascal's assistant, trudging up a mountain with a barometer, Boyle's glass dome, and the breathless mouse, a balloon rising through thinning air, a barometer ticking softly in a library where the storm outside grows near. Let them fade, because your breathing is steady, and the pressure around you, that subtle hug from the sky, is constant, gentle, predictable. There's a kind of peace in knowing that even chaos, the weather, the wind, the wild pressure changes of the world follows rules. And those rules were written in mercury and vacuum and courage. You are resting in the legacy of quiet thinkers. So now, you drift. Let the air carry you. Let the atmosphere wrap around your thoughts and still them. Let the weight of the world not press on you but cradle you. Because tonight, you sleep inside a story that touches the clouds and dives to the seafloor, all bound together by something as soft and as powerful as air. Good night.